welcome. Thank you for coming out in the cold. I know we're Californians, but it's probably a heat wave in Wisconsin. Is it? Yeah. Okay. Strange for this time of year. Okay, so last week we examined issues related to same-sex sexuality. And tonight we're going to turn our attention to another controversial issue, namely capital punishment. So capital punishment, also known as the death penalty, is a state-sanctioned practice of killing a person as a punishment for a crime. So it's a state-sanctioned punishment. The sentence ordering that the offender is to be punished is known as the death sentence, and the act of carrying it out is known as the execution. So let's start with a little history. Capital punishment has been used as a method of both punishment and crime deterrence since the earliest societies. Historical records show that the most ancient primitive tribes utilized methods of punishing wrongdoers, including taking their lives to pay for a crime. Murder was most often the act that warranted this ultimate punishment, but there were in some societies there were much more, just more than that, as we will see. The notion here was a life for a life, and it's been one of the most basic concepts for dealing with in the criminal justice systems of most societies. Tribal societies, as they developed social classes and then government institutions, gave capital punishment over to those institutions to make the right. Very early on, it was usually just people against people. I mean, tribal members would, but once you get these institutions, then they are given the right to do this. And this would include murder, sexual assault, treason, military offenses, etc. One of the earliest documents that we have that supported the death penalty was known as the Code of Hammurabi, 1760 BCE. It was written on stone tablets. Here we find the idea of an eye for an eye, but it was not just murder. Here's some others. If anyone steal the property of a temple or the court, he shall be put to death. And also the one who receives the stolen thing from him shall be put to death. If anyone is committing a robbery and is caught, then he shall be put to death. Might not have as many robberies. These are harsh, but everyone knew what the law was. But this is the one I like. If anyone bring an accusation against a man, and the accused go to the river and leap into the river, if he sink in the river, his accuser shall take possession of his home. But if the river prove that the accused is not guilty, and he escapes unhurt, then he who brought the accusation shall be put to death. So when you read the Code of Hammurabi, there are like 20 different actions that can result in the death penalty.
So where was this code?
This was in Samaria, in the what today would be like Iraq in that area, the middle, Samaria, Mesopotamia, but 1700 BCE. Of course, we also find something similar in the Torah, the Jewish Torah. Murder would result in capital punishment, but also other infractions, such as idol worship, or desecrating the Sabbath. Also, if your son were unruly. I think I read that last time. So the notion of the death penalty early on is a very common thing. It was felt largely as a deterrent, as you can imagine. So if we turn to ancient Greece, we have the Athenian legal system. And this is where customary law was eventually written down. And in 621 BCE by a man by the name of Draco. Have you ever heard of draconian? Comes from Draco. The death penalty was applied under his code for a wide range of crimes, like 20 different crimes could get the death penalty. The next leader by the name of Solon sort of repealed a lot of these and just left murder. So the death penalty was applied to murder, but only with the permission of the victim's family. So that's because in Greek society, the family played a very strong role in a lot of these things. But then we get to the philosophers. We have Protagoras, Greek philosopher, 490 to 420 BCE. He criticized it as a principle of revenge because he claimed that once the damage had been done, it couldn't be taken back. So if the death penalty was to be imposed by society, the only possible reason would be to protect it, but not to get justice. And you often hear that, the notion of justice. So he brought in the idea of the prevention, okay, but not for revenge, not for justice. Plato, 428 and 328, thought that the death penalty should be seen as a form of purification. It wasn't a crime as we understood it. In his work, The Laws, he considered homicide unnatural and not fully consented to by the criminal. I knew I would get some chuckles. This needs a little bit of explanation. Plato, like Socrates, believed that nobody willingly chose to do wrong. Because to do wrong is to harm yourself, if you really understand it. I think, would we all admit that if you're doing something that's wrong, you're really harming yourself? And if that's the case, if you do wrong, you're doing it because you're ignorant. That's what he meant by nobody willingly does this. They do it ignorantly, thinking one thing when they don't know the total ramifications of their actions. Now, that will actually come back to later be modified in modern society as the notion that someone can be criminally insane. They don't really know what they're doing. Socrates took it all the way out. Anyone who does something like that obviously doesn't know what they're doing because they're harming themselves. And no one wants to harm themselves. So, Aristotle, who was Plato's student, thought free will was the proper aspect of man and the citizen was responsible. But he also believed, and you can see how this becomes an argument later, he also believed that the criminal still had value in society in that he could be re-educated. That no one was ever to the point where they couldn't be re-educated. So he held that capital punishment was only in the most extreme examples where there was no hope for a person being re-educated. If we go to ancient Rome, the application of the death penalty against Roman citizens was unusual. If you were a foreigner, if you were a slave, death penalty. But it was very rare for a Roman citizen to get the death penalty. Now, there were other punishments, but somehow being a citizen puts you in a higher ranking. Now, how does this apply? Well, one of the arguments against, as we'll see, against the death penalty is that it isn't evenly applied. So this is an ancient notion of that. And they admitted it. A Roman citizen was believed to be higher than a foreigner or a slave, et cetera, et cetera. There's an example. There was a historic debate, and this was followed by a vote in the Roman Senate, to decide the fate of Senator Catiline, who had tried to overthrow the government in 63 BCE. There was an attempt to overthrow the government and the Senate. The Roman consul at the time, that was one of the leading members of the executive branch, argued in favor that all the conspirators should get the death penalty along with Catiline. One person, very famous person, opposed it. Julius Caesar. Interesting. Because we know what Julius Caesar will later do, or attempt to do, and then he will get the knife himself. Anyway, like I said, foreigners, slaves, they were executed for crimes, not even just murder. So if we move into the medieval period in modern Europe, before the development of the modern prison system, the death penalty was used widespread. Many, many, many different crimes, not just murder. Henry VIII's rule, 72,000 people are estimated to have been executed under his rule for various crimes. So there was that side, but there were also, from very early on, some who opposed the death penalty. A famous Jewish legal scholar by the name of Moses Maimonides wrote, "It is better and more satisfactory to acquit 1,000 guilty persons than to put a single innocent man to death." It's another argument that will filter through. He argued that executing an accused criminal on anything less than absolute certainty, which was absolutely almost impossible, would lead to a slippery slope of decreasing burdens of proof, until we would be convicting merely according to the judge's caprice, or perhaps the jury's caprice. So he felt it's better to have a situation where if one person can be executed wrongly, that should take precedence. And that was in the 12th century. So there have always been arguments for and against. So let's turn to the modern era. In England, in the 18th century, there's no police force. Do you recognize that? There's no police force in the 18th century. So Parliament drastically increased the number of capital offenses to over 200. There were 200 offenses that could lead to the death penalty. This was in England in the 18th century. Most of these were property offenses. For example, cutting down a cherry tree in an orchard, or stealing a loaf of bread. And what's interesting, there's a tie with Australia there, because if you didn't get the death penalty, you were sent to Australia. And these were the convicts. These are the convicts. In 1820, there were 160 possible capital offenses, including shoplifting, petty theft, stealing cattle. It was called the Bloody Code. It's called the Bloody Code. It was tempered, however, by juries. We know this historically. Sometimes they refused to convict, or judges who, in the case of, let's say, petty theft, arbitrarily set the values stolen below the amount that required death. But the century also saw the first treatises against capital punishment. In Italy, Caesar Beccaria's, and this is a famous text, on crimes and punishment, not to be confused with Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. This is on crimes and punishment, written in 1764, was the first detailed analysis of capital punishment, which demanded the abolition of the death penalty, 1764. He openly condemned the death penalty on two grounds. One, He didn't believe the state possessed the right to take lives. 2, because it was neither useful nor necessary. Regarding the latter, he wrote this: "There is no one who, on reflection, would choose the total and permanent loss of his own liberty, no matter how advantageous a crime might be. Therefore, the intensity of a sentence of servitude for life, sustained for the death penalty, has everything needed to deter the most determined spirit." So he was arguing that life imprisonment was probably a greater deterrent than the death penalty. With capital punishment, one crime is required for each example offered to the nation. With the penalty of a lifetime at hard labor, a single crime affords a host of lasting examples. The idea here is that an execution is a single severe event in which people get riled up at the time but not remembered by others, whereas life imprisonment provides a continuing reminder for the punishment. He adds to thinking 2 claims about the bad social effects of capital punishment. Now remember, this is in the 18th century. 1, for many, the death penalty becomes a spectacle. And, executions at one time were public. And they've become spectacles. The hanging, or in France, the guillotine. And I'll get to that in a moment. And that's what it was really about. It was this, and in the long run, it didn't really have any great effect. It was not useful because of the example of cruelty. If the state is capable of this type of cruelty and is exemplifying it, what is the lesson? Cruelty isn't necessarily bad. So he thought that these were things that also added to it. In England, Jeremy Bentham, I don't know if you've known, he's founder of modern utilitarianism. He was greatly influenced by Beccaria and called for the abolition of the death penalty, 1832. Later, Charles Dickens, Karl Marx noted the incidence of increased violent criminality at the time and place of executions. Sort of like at these big sporting events. You notice how there's always someone out in the parking lot getting beat up these days? He said that these spectacles increased criminality. And it was one reason why executions started to be moved away from the public square into prisons. Because you're out there, this violent activity, people are getting riled up. Well, what do you expect? Especially if there's some grog around and those things. Okay, so that, on the other hand, to take the opposite position, another utilitarian, John Stuart Mill, defended capital punishment. In 1868, as a member of Parliament, he argued that capital punishment was justified for aggravated murder. He also maintained that the sober pang of a rapid death is in actuality far less cruel than a long life in prison. So he was saying yes, a long life in prison is worse, but he was sort of, that's why we shouldn't have that. That's more cruel than the death penalty. Because we're going to get this constant argument when we especially get to modernity. Is this a cruel and unjust penalty, which is against the 8th Amendment of the Constitution? That's where that becomes important. But we'll get there. So early forms of capital punishment were designed to be slow, painful, and torturous. These days, we try and make it as quick as possible. That was part of the process, was to make it slow, painful, torturous. That was part of it. early on, death by stoning, burning at the stake, all sorts of varieties. During the 18th and 19th centuries, legal bodies found faster and less painful approaches, including hanging, firing squad, and in France, the infamous beheading with a guillotine. Now, speaking of the guillotine, one of modern Europe's most adamant spokesmen against the death penalty was the French novelist Albert Camus. He wrote a famous essay called Reflections on the Guillotine. In it, he not only argued against capital punishment's lack of effectiveness, which many did, but more significantly, if you read that essay, and it's a good one to read, he looks at the reality of the event as opposed to abstract thinking about it. And he does this at the beginning of his essay by recalling something from his own life. And I'll read you this part. Shortly before World War I, a murderer whose crime was particularly shocking, he had killed a family of farmers, was condemned to death in Algiers, and that's where Camus was raised. He was an agricultural worker who had slaughtered in bloody delirium and had rendered his offense still more serious by robbing his victims. The case was widely publicized, generally agreed that decapitation was too mild a punishment for such a monster. I have been told this was the opinion of my father, who was particularly outraged by the murders. One of the few things I know about him is that this was the first time in his life he wanted to attend an execution. He got up while it was still dark, for the place where the guillotine was set up was at the other end of the city, and once there found himself among a great crowd of spectators. He never told what he saw that morning. My mother could only report that he rushed wildly into the house, refused to speak, threw himself on the bed, and began to vomit. He had just discovered the reality concealed beneath the great formulas that ordinarily serve to mask it. Instead of thinking of those murdered, he could only recall the trembling body he had seen thrown on a board as its head fell off. Okay, let's move to the Americas. In the colonies, first legal executions began as early as 1630. As in England, the death penalty was imposed for many crimes, even minor ones. The first man formally executed, this is a question for Jeopardy, Final Jeopardy. The first man formally executed in a British colony was a Jamestown council member, George Kendall. Remember that name in case it ever comes. Who faced a firing squad for alleged espionage activity. So, first capital punishment case. When James Madison proposed the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, by the standards of his time, it could not have reasonably been interpreted as banning the death penalty. It may have been cruel, but it wasn't unusual. It was used a lot. So following the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment, when the minds begin to open up and question all sorts of things, thought in mid-1800s in America, people were beginning to oppose the death penalty. And some states went as far as to abolishing it. Okay, here's a question. First state to abolish capital punishment. Michigan. Michigan, 1845. Followed by Wisconsin, which entered the Union in 1848 without a death penalty statute. Near the end of the century, 1888, these are little facts that they'll come up somewhere. A man by the name of William Kemmler became the first person to be executed in the electric chair in New York. So it began to use 1888. An appeal was made on Kemmler's behalf to the New York Court of Appeals on the grounds that electricity was a cruel punishment and therefore was contrary to the Constitution. The appeal was denied. The court ruled, although the mode of death described is conceded to be unusual, there is no common knowledge or consent that it is cruel. It is a question of fact that an electric current of sufficient intensity skillfully produces death without unnecessary suffering, unless things go wrong, which they have historically. In 1924, a Chinese American by the name of Ji Zhong became the first person executed in the United States by cyanide gas in Nevada. The Nevada State Journal proclaimed, Nevada's novel death law is upheld by the highest court, humanity. However, the San Jose Mercury News printed, 100 years from now, Nevada will be referred to as a heathen commonwealth, controlled by savages with only the outward symbols of civilization. So the death penalty it's one of the controversial issues. We tend to, I think it's one we've tended to forget a little bit about lately, but people can take extreme views here. It's either upheld by humanity or savage. The 1950s and 60s saw growing public protests over capital punishment and about everything else in the world as well. And the number of executions in the United States began to increase. Decrease. Yeah, decrease. I've been looking at the stock market all day. In 1967, there were only 2 executions in the United States. And the following year saw the beginning of an unofficial moratorium on executions. So the public conscience was now starting to bring this to the fore, to debate. So sort of a moratorium against it. And then in 1972, there was a very famous case. Furman versus Georgia. The Supreme Court declared capital punishment unconstitutional as it was then applied. The court said the death penalty was a violation of the Eighth Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment because of the inconsistency in who was given a death sentence and who was not. So between 1972 and 1976, 35 states wrote new capital punishment laws to try and meet the Supreme Court's new suggestions. How did they do this? Some states introduced a penalty trial after conviction. You know, if you're convicted in a trial now, you could then have the penalty phase. Before that, that was not the case. So this was one way to try and make it more fair. A second group just made the death penalty mandatory. I mean, whoever it is, there's no, for anyone convicted of a capital crime. Anyone, no. So then in 76, in another Supreme Court decision, this was Gregg versus Georgia, the court ruled that the first type, penalty trial, was constitutional. That's why we have that today. While the mandatory sentence was unduly harsh and rigid, made no allowance for particular circumstances. So executions began again. 1977. though many states were still waiting for a ruling on one other major issue, whether this penalty was actually being applied equally. From 1977 through 85, only 50 executions took place, but there were 2,000 men, mainly men, on death row. The test case came with another Georgia case, Mccleskey versus Kemp, 1987. In it, lawyers for the condemned man submitted a careful study of how the death penalty had been applied in Georgia during the 1970s. The study was led by a University of Iowa professor, David Baldus, showed that blacks who had killed whites had been sentenced to die 7 times more than whites who had killed blacks. In its decision, the Supreme Court acknowledged that there seemed to be some statistical racial discrimination in Georgia's application of the death penalty. But the justice ruled 5-4 that a mere statistical variation was not enough to invalidate the death penalty. Since that time, the Supreme Court has made some further rulings unconstitutional to execute someone who is under 18 years of age when the crime was committed. Also struck down the death penalty for crimes against individuals that do not result in death. So, today, 22 states, plus Washington, D.C., have abolished the death penalty. 3 states have a governor-imposed moratorium: California, Oregon, Pennsylvania. So that leaves about 50 other states that still have the death penalty. 22 have abolished it. 3 have moratorium, so 45. I was never good at math. The states that have abolished it are mainly in the north, northeast, completely abolished it, which is interesting in terms of talking about the progressive Methodists in the north and northeast. You can look them up. I'm not going to go through all of them. But the U.S. is consistently a top 5 nation in the world for instituting the death penalty. Since 1976, there have been a total of 1,389 executions. In recent years, about 50 prisoners each year have been executed. There are more than 3,000 inmates waiting on death row in America's prisons. And much of this backlog is caused by appeals, and that will be an argument that we'll see that will come up for those who are in favor of the death penalty and its cost, etc. What's the most common form of execution at the moment? Lethal injection. However, some states still use gas chambers and electrocution. Idaho, up until 1978, allowed death by firing squad. I don't know, do you remember Gary Gilmore? Gary Gilmore committed some hellacious murders. He was a Mormon, and he asked for execution by firing squad. And that was because he believed, and this was part of Mormon lore, not law, that a murderer must literally shed his own blood in order to be forgiven by God. So by being shot by firing squad, you spill your blood. And he was allowed to do that, and he was executed in 1977. A year later, actually in 2009, that was outlawed. So you can no longer be executed by firing squad in Idaho, except in 2010, when Ronnie Lee Gardner, another Mormon, was executed by firing squad because he had requested it. Why was that allowed? Because his crime took place before the law had changed. So 2010 was the last execution by firing squad. How about religion? What do the religious faiths say? Well, as you might imagine, there's a lot of disagreement among many denominations, religious faiths. We'll just look at two. Let's look at Catholicism and the United Methodist Church. In terms of the Roman Catholic Church, a recent statement by a United States cardinal explains their position. The Pope and the bishops, using their prudential judgment, have concluded that in contemporary society, the death penalty ought not to be invoked, because on balance, it does more harm than good. The one thing you can say, the Catholics are consistent here, right to life. Okay? Right to life, they're consistent with that argument. And John Paul II condemned it as cruel and unnecessary. The United Methodist Church opposes the death penalty. It is stated, quote, "The death penalty denies the power of Christ to redeem, restore, and transform all human beings." It kind of goes back to Aristotle. Remember what Aristotle said? People can change. There's always a possibility for someone to be better. Now, this, of course, puts it in a religious context, the redemptive side of things, but a similar sort of argument. We believe that God's grace is ever reaching out to restore our relationship with God and with each other. The death penalty denies the possibility of new life and reconciliation. The United Methodist Church also recognizes the unjust and flawed implementation of the death penalty, pointing out executions reveal racism and a bias against the mentally ill, not to mention the number of people who have been executed and then found to have been innocent. Okay, let's look at the list of arguments for and against. I think everyone have a sheet. If you don't, there's some in the back. If you didn't get them coming in. So let's start with arguments against capital punishment. 1, everyone has an inalienable human right to life, even those who commit murder. The Declaration of Independence gives 3 examples of inalienable rights in the well-known phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Sentencing a person to death and executing them violates the first of these, the right to life. Thus, Amnesty International believes or claims, quote, "The death penalty is the ultimate denial of human rights. It is the premeditated and cold-blooded killing of a human being by the state in the name of justice. It violates the right to life. It is the ultimate cruel, inhuman, and degrading punishment." And as Catholic Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, Archbishop of Washington, wrote, "The death penalty diminishes all of us, increases disrespect for human life, and offers the tragic illusion that we can teach that killing is wrong by killing." Point 2, death, and we've seen this come up in our historical survey, death constitutes cruel and unusual punishment, which is prohibited by the 8th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The various means used to kill a criminal, including lethal injection, are cruel, as shown by numerous examples. For example, you don't have this, but this is, on May 24th, 1989, Stephen McCoy had a violent physical reaction to the injection, heaving chest, gasping, choking, back arching off the gurney, which lasted for almost half an hour. The Texas Attorney General admitted the inmate seemed to have had somewhat of a strong reaction, adding the drugs might have been administered in a heavier dose or more rapidly. So in other words, things can go wrong. And then it does become cruel. Point 3, only God should create and destroy life. Many Christians believe God commanded, "Thou shalt not kill," and that this is a clear instruction with no exceptions. The argument is used to oppose abortion and euthanasia, so it should also apply to capital punishment. This is asking for consistency. 4, if killing is immoral by legitimizing the very behavior that the law seeks to repress, namely killing, capital punishment is counterproductive in the moral message it conveys. 5, the death penalty is used disproportionately against the poor, racial, and ethnic minorities who cannot afford expensive legal counsel. 6, the death penalty is applied arbitrarily and inconsistently. Wrongly convicted innocent people have received death penalty sentences and were tragically killed by the state. 7, a rehabilitated criminal can make a moral, valuable contribution to society. 8, from a practical standpoint, while many people assume the state saves money by using the death penalty, since an executed person no longer requires confinement, health care, and related expenses, in reality, the modern application of capital punishment is far more expensive than a system utilizing life without parole sentences. Okay. So those are the basic arguments against capital punishment. What are the arguments for capital punishment? 1, because they have taken the life of another, those who commit murder have forfeited their own right to life. 2, as historically accepted, capital punishment is a just form of retribution, expressing and reinforcing the moral indignation of the victim's relatives and law-abiding citizens in general. While the death penalty is not going to bring the victim back to his or her family, it at least gives the grieving family, community, and friends much needed closure. 3, the biblical sanction, an eye for an eye, or a fair punishment, demands a similar response to the crime itself. You take a life, you give a life. 4, capital punishment has a uniquely potent deterrent effect on potentially violent offenders, for whom the threat of imprisonment is not a sufficient restraint. Proponents point to studies that have tracked the effects of the death penalty over several years and have found it is highly effective in deterring crime. Arguing for capital punishment, the Indiana prosecuting attorney wrote, "There are some defendants who have earned the ultimate punishment of our society, that our society has to offer, by committing murder with aggravating circumstances. I believe life is sacred. It cheapens the life of an innocent murder victim to say that society has no right to keep the murderer from ever killing again. In my view, society has not only the right, but the duty to act in defense and protect the innocent. Point 5. It is possible to fashion laws and procedures that ensure only those who are deserving of death are executed. Point 6. While mistakes can and have been made, the fact that there must be a unanimous jury of 12 of the persons of the accused peers to vote on the death penalty is a basic safeguard. The rare possibility of a mistake is a price worth paying for society being able to protect itself. 7. The costs associated with the death penalty are high due to the cost of decades of appeals before the inmate will even make it to the death chamber. I believe it's an average of 14 years. On the other hand, the cost of life in prison can be astronomical as well. Finally, the death penalty is not racially biased. Current percentages of those on death row: blacks 42%, 41.29, Latino 13.5, white 42.3. Can you see a problem though with that? What doesn't it take into account? Well, what's the percentage of black population total? It's 15%, yeah. So, if you, I shouldn't, but statistics can be misleading. You got to look and see what they argue. Okay, so those are the basic arguments for and against, a bit of the history. I could have done a lot more on the history, but I thought that we'd... next week, we're going to move to suicide or euthanasia. Do people have the right to take their own lives if they so desire? Again, a very controversial issue. One name probably pops into your head. Jack Kevorkian. Yeah. So we'll look at this issue. We'll look at it historically, cross-culturally. Suicide to start with, and then euthanasia as the right to die. Okay, thanks for coming. And we shall carry on next week. And then the final week we'll look at the question of a just war. That's another tough one, yeah. Okay, good, thanks.